Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. We continue our new series, Manuscript Hunters. Last week we focused on young Robert Curzon and his trip to the east, where he visited the monasteries in the Nitrian desert in Egypt, and he discovered some late but important manuscripts of the New Testament. This episode we pick up with his visit to the Greek Orthodox monasteries in Meteora, Greece. Now, Meteora is a rock formation in northwestern Greece, featuring one of the largest and most precipitously built complexes of Eastern Orthodox monasteries, second in importance only to Mount Athos, which Curzon also visited with much more success than he found at Meteora. The remaining 6 of the original 24 monasteries in Meteora are built on immense natural pillars and hill-like rounded boulders that dominate the local scene. Between the 13th and 14th centuries, 24 monasteries were established atop the rocks for their protection. Other than modern amenities, these monasteries that you see today were much the same, only more rustic and even more difficult to reach. You would be hoisted up in a rope cage, or you could climb some very scary looking ladders attached to the steep cliffs. And today there are only 6 remaining monasteries at Meteora, 7 at Curzon's day. First is the monastery of Great Meteoron. Secondly, the monastery of Rusanu. Third, the monastery of Varlam. Fourth, the monastery of St. Nicholas Anapausis. Fifth, the monastery of St. Stephanos, and 6th, monastery of the Holy Trinity. So let's take a minute aerial tour of Meteora for reference. Please enjoy. Now, in Curzon's travels, he had secured safe passage to Meteora by the local pasha, which was a very important Turkish official. And he had to cross difficult mountain terrain en route to Meteora. They needed to show their letter from the pasha on more than one occasion to avoid robbery or even worse. And Curzon has this to say about his trip. The scenery of Meteora is of a very singular kind. The end of a range of rocky hills seems to have been broken off by some earthquake or washed away by the deluge, leaving only a series of 20 or 30 tall, thin, smooth, needle-like rocks, many hundred feet in height, some like gigantic tusks, some shaped like sugar loaves, and some like vast stalagmites. These rocks surround a beautiful grassy plain, on 3 sides of which there grow groups of detached trees like those in an English park. Some of the rocks shoot up quite clean and perpendicularly from the smooth green grass. The monastery of Barlan stood perpendicularly above us on the top of a much higher rock like the tower of this church. Here we fired off a gun, which was intended to answer the same purpose as knocking on the door in a more civilized place. and we all strained our necks in looking up at the monastery to see whether any would answer our call. Presently we were hailed by someone in the sky whose voice came down to us like the cry of a bird, and we saw the face and gray beard of an old monk some 100 feet above us peering out of a window or door. He asked us who we were, what we wanted, and so forth, to which we replied that we were travelers, harmless people who wished to be admitted into the monastery to stay the night, that we had come all the way from Corfu to see the wonders of Meteora, and as it was now getting late, we appeared to his feelings of hospitality and Christian benevolence. At length he let down a thin cord, to which I attached a letter of introduction I had brought from Corfu, and after some delay, a much larger rope was seen descending with a hook at the end to which a strong net was attached. On reaching the rock on which we stood, the net was spread open. My 2 servants sat down upon it, and the 4 corners being attached to the hook, a signal was made, and they began slowly ascending into the air, twisting round and round like a leg of mutton hanging to a bottle jack. The rope was old and mended, and the height from the ground to the door above was, afterwards we learned, some 37 fathoms or 222 feet. When they reached the top, I saw 2 stout monks reach their arms out of the door and pull in the 2 servants by main force, as there was no contrivance like a turning crane for bringing them nearer to the landing place. The whole process appeared so dangerous, I determined to go up by climbing a series of ladders which were suspended by large wooden pegs on the face of the precipice, and which reached the top of the rock in another direction round a corner to the right. The lowest ladder was approached by a pathway leading to a rickety wooden platform which overhung a deep gorge. From this point, the ladders hung perpendicularly upon the bare rock, and I climbed up 3 or 4 of them very soon. But coming to one, the lower end of which had swung away from the top of the one below, I had some difficulty in stretching across from the one to the other. And here, unluckily, I looked down and found I had turned a sort of angle in the precipice, that I was not over the rocky platform where I had left the horses, but that the precipice went sheer down so tremendous a depth that my head turned when I surveyed the distant valley over which I was hanging in the air like a fly on a wall. The monks in the monastery saw me hesitate and called out to me to take courage and hold on. Making an effort, I overcame my dizziness and clambered up to a small iron door through which I crept into a court of the monastery, where I was welcomed by the monks and the 2 servants who had been hauled up by the rope. Now, once Curzon was settled in, he met the Agumenos, who was the head abbot, and pulled out soon enough his handy rosolio, his drink, and shared a few cups. Does that sound familiar? See the previous episode where this seems to be a friendly tact of Curzon when he meets his friends in the monasteries. In his travel diary, Visit to the Monasteries of the Levant, he talks about the architecture of the church, their various buildings, and the practices of the monks. Speaking of the monks, he writes about them in a rather unfavorable manner. He disparages their appearance, their unkempt beards, their personal habits. However, he's here for their library. Ah, yes, their library. In this particular library, it contained about 1,000 volumes, mostly late copies. He had his eyes set on 2 late copies of the Gospels, but they would not part with it. Strike one. So he moved on to the next monastery, which would be the monastery of Hagios Stephanos, which had about 14 monks and several women. He inquired soon about the library and discovered there were about 150 books, but unfortunately, again, late copies and nothing worth his attention. Strike two. Then he moved on to the monastery of Agia Triada, which is Holy Trinity Monastery, where, alas, he was disappointed yet again with their library. Strike three, and normally you're out. But maybe one more chance. His last visit was his only hope, which would be the great monastery of Meteora, the largest of the 7. and he was drawn up to it by a rope net as before. Soon he saw their library, and he wrote this about two of the books he was fond of. After looking over the books on the shelves, the librarian, an old gray-bearded monk, opened a great chest in which things belonging to the church were kept. And here I found 10 or 12 manuscripts of the Gospels, all of the 11th or 12th century. They were upon vellum. To my great joy, the librarian allowed me to take these two books to the room of the Aguamenos, who agreed to sell them to me for I forget how many pieces of gold, which I counted out to him immediately, and which he seemed to pocket with the sincerest satisfaction. Never was anyone more welcome to his money, although I left myself but little to pay the expenses of my journey back to Corfu. Such books as these would be treasures in the finest national collection in Europe. And as it turns out, his purchase was not to last. An argument arose among the monks about their share of the money and who should be the one to authorize the transaction. And the deal was over almost as soon as it started, and he returned, sadly, his two books. Well, there's much more detail in his travel diary, but in order not to bore you with more and more reading, let's just say his trip to Meteora was less than he had hoped for. Next week, we'll wrap up Curzon's story with his trip to the monasteries of Mount Athos and a summary of his finds there and the importance those manuscripts were to New Testament studies. Let me say that it may appear that Curzon's trips were motivated by his love for antiquities of the East that would find their homes in the great libraries of England and Europe. And this is true. But he not only collected manuscripts, but other artifacts such as icons and crosses, coins, small sculptures, and tapestries. In many cases, he gained trust in his host through his personality, his rosolio, and his money, especially his money. We will talk later about the ethics of removing these manuscripts from their home and what implications it has for today's manuscript hunters. But in the meantime, if you enjoy these episodes, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. I will include links for further research in the description below. So be well and stay tuned for next week's episode, the final of Robert Curzon's exploits with the monasteries of Mount Athos, brought to you by none other than the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.